Hello, and welcome back to our series of lessons called Positive Living in a Negative World. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the lost, and we're going to springboard from the passage in Luke 19, verses 1 through 10, as you can see here on the title slide. There are many reasons that people may be lost. Sometimes it causes one to be a little bit exasperated. Sometimes we get frustrated. Sometimes it's because we can't really follow the directions or read the map. Someone may also feel lost because the journey just seems daunting. It just seems like it's too far. It just seems like there's no way to accomplish what one feels or knows they are called to accomplish. And then, of course, sometimes someone has been blindfolded in some way. Maybe they've done it to themselves. Maybe they are wandering around in the darkness. They just do not have any clue which direction to follow. And these are all things that are true for people spiritually. We're going to look at the fact that some people are lost. Here's some other ideas that may go along with that: being disoriented or bewildered, unclear, unsure, confused, or perplexed. We have people in our culture, and sometimes us, who don't know where they need to be heading. This is the fifth of our 5 convictions concerning reality. We started this series looking at 3 introductory classes, just looking at the truth of our negative environment, our positive call, the fact that we dwell in the midst of the mess. And then once we got to the end of December, we started these 5 convictions concerning reality. The fact that we're in a fallen world, the fact that we and all human beings have a physical and spiritual nature, and then, therefore, the truth that we are involved in spiritual warfare. We're told that our battle, our struggle, is not against flesh and blood. And then all of that really having to do with the fact that we are eternal in nature. We're not going to end our existence when our physical bodies die. We will go on forever. And we looked at passages concerning that last week. Well, now we need to also, with all that being given, we need to have as a truth that is sure and steadfast in our lives the fact that there are lost people. Now, this is something where in our culture and even in a lot of Christianity, broadly speaking, people have really abandoned this idea. Usually, even if we believe some people are lost, we may not behave in a way that shows that we believe that they are lost. We're going to look at some passages concerning the lost at the start and Jesus' mission. And then we're going to look at, and of course, note that that needs to be our mission as well, seeking and saving the lost. But notice what gave him the motivation, or at least part of it, is his compassion that he had for the people. So we're going to look at a bunch of different passages tonight, and hopefully all of us will be motivated to make sure that we're not wandering around through this life thinking that everyone's okay. We need to understand a conviction we need to have if we're a follower of Jesus is that there are lost people. So let's look at the very first passage that's on the outline here, Luke 19, 1 through 10. We're going to start with 2 very familiar passages, this one here in Luke and then one from Mark to start tonight. Luke 19, 1 through 10. He entered Jericho and was passing through. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. So before we look at verses 5 through 10, let's just notice here that Zacchaeus, we might say if someone, now Zacchaeus, I think it's very safe to say that before he interacted with Jesus, all he was interested in was seeing Jesus. He just wanted to see who this man was that everyone was talking about. There was a buzz throughout all of Israel concerning this Jesus and the miracles he was doing and the teaching that he was able to give to the people. Zacchaeus, though, was short, bottom line, and he needed to climb up into a tree to see him. And he wanted to see him badly enough that he climbed the sycamore tree and got up there so he could have a view of this Jesus. Verse 5, and when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So Zacchaeus did this. He hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all grumbled. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. Wow. So several things here in these verses, then we'll look at the last two. So Jesus knows who this guy is. That had to be quite stunning right off the bat. So he says his name, calls to him, hurry, come down. I must stay at your house today. I mean, quite a statement. So Zacchaeus listens to him. He does exactly what he says. And notice, and received him joyfully. I think this is really important. I think this is part of what we are called to concerning hospitality. And I'll continue to make statements similar to this. I don't think necessarily we have a hard time inviting people to our houses and feeding them a meal and things like that. But I think what we in our culture have a harder time with is receiving people into our lives, actually allowing people in to develop relationships. And so I think that might be something that we all need to, when we read a passage like this, pray about, think about, and work on in our lives. But Zacchaeus, he received the Lord joyfully. And then there are the famous theys. They saw it and they all grumbled. The people who are always looking for a reason to complain. And here, I'm sure they felt it was legitimate. Zacchaeus, a chief tax collector, one that the culture, for the most part, would have hated and considered evil. And obviously, they considered him a sinner. He's gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Well, from our standpoint, if we're going to save the lost, we need to be willing to interact with them. We need to be willing to talk with them. We need to be willing to have a conversation to hopefully save them, to bring them to Jesus Christ. Well, the people who were complaining about Jesus being with this person, they just did not have a clue what Jesus was all about. And we're going to see that in just a second. Now, verse 8 is extremely interesting. So we don't know what kind of time maybe has passed. So have they already eaten a meal? Have they already had a lot of conversation? We don't know from this text. Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. The tax collectors were known for charging people extra, which became part of their pay. And so, cheats, sinners, frauds. And he's saying, though, if he's done that, he's going to restore it fourfold. So quite a statement of repentance. And when we repent, when we decide to turn our lives in a new direction, there should be a thought to restoring anything that we can restore. If we had been a thief before we came to Christ, and it was in any way possible to give back what we had stolen, whether on paper or actual goods or whatever the case may be, in our day and age, we should want to make things right. And he is willing to make things right. And notice then what Jesus says to close out this section. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham." And then notice, so fabulous message for Zacchaeus and his household, but a great statement not only for Zacchaeus and his household and the people standing around, even the grumblers, but a great statement for us. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. This is why Jesus came. Now, we are all lost without Jesus. Jesus came to seek us, to reach out to us, to draw all to himself, and to save. This is what Jesus was and is and always will be all about. He wants people to be saved. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Well, obviously, we're given direct commands to preach and evangelize, so we don't need to look at it from this perspective, but I think it's worthwhile to look at it from the standpoint of, you know what? We're supposed to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. We're supposed to be doing the things that he did. Now, we cannot provide atonement for sin, obviously, but the things that we are able to copy in him, we are to. And he came to seek and save the lost. So our mission, part of what we do as followers of Jesus, should be to seek out, and that's a proactive statement. That's not just sit back and wait for lost people to come to us. Seek them and save them. And again, Jesus saves in a way, the profound way, the cross way that we can't, but we can lead people to salvation. We can lead people to Jesus Christ. We can save the lost in that way. So a couple questions here. And whenever we do these reflections or thought ideas, feel free to pause the video, think about these things, pray about these things. If you're watching this with someone, you can discuss it a little bit and then say a little prayer. Anything, of course, is welcome, and everything that you might do to help yourself grow spiritually, of course, is encouraged. So, number one, where did Jesus first find you? Up a tree? Out on a limb? I like the way they worded that. But where were you when Jesus found you? And then how did he get you to come down? A little coaxing? A big scare? An invitation you couldn't refuse? What's your conversion story? And if you don't have one yet, please reach out to us. We can help with that here at our congregation. Whether me or one of the other evangelists, or of course our elders, all of our members are able to tell and explain the basics of Christianity and the basics of salvation. So, but for those of us in Christ already, how did it happen? A little coaxing, a big scare, an invitation you couldn't refuse. I like that. Just think about that for a little bit this evening. All right, and then Mark 2:13-17, our second passage here. And this is the calling of Matthew. So, he went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. And as he passed by, he saw Levi, this is Matthew, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. Well, with Zacchaeus, it was, "Get down out of that tree. I must stay at your house today." And Zacchaeus got out of the tree, came to Jesus, received him with joy, and then did what Jesus said. Well, here with Matthew, it's very simple. Follow me. And what did he do? he rose and followed him. We just can't, well, we can through the scriptures, but we weren't there. We don't know exactly what made Jesus the way that he was, as far as the charisma, as far as the attraction, the the ability to say to someone, follow me, and the person just gets up and does it. With the fishermen at the first ones that Jesus called, it was, hey, come, follow me. And they got rid of their nets and followed him. He had a way. Now, these same things made those who were against him very, very mad. But for those who are willing, and hopefully that's all of us who are in this class, whether it's right now or someone watching this in the future, but he had a way. And hopefully all of us are willing to copy that. When Jesus says to do something, we need to do it. If he says, go out and spread the gospel, we need to go out and spread the gospel. If he says, follow me, we need to follow him. If he says, take up your cross daily, we need to take up our crosses daily. If he says, die to yourself, we need to die to ourselves. So Matthew gets up, verse 15, and as he reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? So we have the same grumbling. Jesus, once again, at a tax collector's house, but a lot of grumbling about it. People do not like Christianity when it gets real. The Pharisees, the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw this, they did not like it. Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. I came to seek and save the lost. We read in Luke, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus wants to bring people who have severed their relationship with God, he wants to bring them home. He wants to bring them back into a right relationship with God. The way this became possible is because of what he did on the cross. But even before he went to the cross, this is what he was about. We need to want the same things. Similar questions here. How sick were you before you saw your need for a spiritual doctor? The great physician, Jesus Christ. How sick were you? And number 2, what from this story can you practice in your outreach? So take a moment to think about what Jesus did with Matthew and what we can do with those with whom we cross paths. All right. So now let's kind of shift. We've looked at Jesus' goal in seeking and saving the lost and in calling not the righteous, but sinners back to him. Now let's note these passages that talk about Jesus' compassion. And we're going to look at passages from Matthew and Luke. And we're going to see a little bit of a difference in them. First, this one, Matthew 9:35 to 38. Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. So let's pause there just for a moment. He was teaching, he was proclaiming, and notice here it's called the good news of the kingdom. The good news, and we don't want to substitute, they're not synonyms, but it's the same gospel. It's the good news of what God is providing through Jesus. So the gospel of the kingdom, the gospel of salvation, the good news about himself, really, is what we get down to, of course, after the fact. So he was teaching, proclaiming, and then notice, as always with Jesus, of course, perfectly, he put it into practice, healing every disease and every affliction. The miracles of the first century were given as evidence that the proclamation and the teaching were true. And so Jesus, of course, had the whole package. And then the apostles were given the ability to do miracles as well, to confirm, to show that this is real and this is true. But what I want us to focus on is verse 36. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. He immediately will talk about the harvest. So he's talking about spiritual needs here. He's talking about people just wandering around through life, but he compares them to sheep that are just wandering around on the countryside, sheep without a shepherd. Sometimes when we see people just wandering around through life without direction and maybe in sin, we don't have compassion sometimes. Sometimes we kind of resent it. Sometimes we're kind of angry. Sometimes we act like the scribes of the Pharisees. What's wrong with these people? Jesus, of course, did not have that reaction. He had compassion for them. And he then wanted to bring them home. And that needs to be our desire. But we need to believe that they are lost, that they are sheep wandering around aimlessly. Again, a lot of times we feel that everyone's okay. Everyone's just doing their thing. It's all right. Well, it's not all right. They're like sheep without a shepherd. We need to help them. They're on a path to destruction. If we were about to go off a cliff, we would want someone to stop us. We need to help as best we can. So then he says to his disciples, verse 37, the harvest is plentiful. There are a lot of people out there wandering around like sheep without a shepherd. There are a lot of people who are lost. There are a lot of people who need a spiritual healer. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And then notice the prayer. Now, again, we have plenty of examples and plenty of commands to proclaim Jesus Christ, to be people who are willing to declare who he is, confess his great name. But here, the exhortation is for us to pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. We need to pray that people will go out. I don't think that excludes ourselves. Obviously, we are part of that. But the prayer is that the Lord of the harvest will send out laborers into his harvest. So we need to be praying not only for ourselves, but that others will be motivated to head out, that others will listen to the call, that others will say, as many of the prophets did, hey, God, here I am, send me. We need to be willing, and we need to pray that God will find others who are willing to be sent. So, Matthew 14. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd. And notice once again, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Can you imagine being there and having your little kid healed, or your spouse healed, or one of your parents healed? I mean, can we just imagine it? Now, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages to buy food for themselves. And this was actually a compassionate statement. The disciples were worried about the people and worried that they were going to need to eat. But Jesus said, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. And I love that because, of course, his disciples have no idea what he's about to do. So anyway, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. They said to him, we have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish. And he said, bring them here to me. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So from 5 loaves and 2 fish, 5,000 men plus the women and children ate and were satisfied. Absolutely incredible. Later in Matthew, we have the feeding of the 4,000, and also it states that Jesus had compassion for them. Well, let's move to Luke and look at 3 examples. And here we see the broad view here in Matthew. Compassion for the crowds. And we need to have compassion for the crowds. And we need to pray that the Lord of the harvest will send out laborers into his harvest field. But in Luke, we see some examples where it's very, very personal. And I think this is where I think both are true. We need to have a clear conviction, a strong conviction concerning the lost. And we need to care about the lost in a broad sense. Here where I am located, I need to care about the people in central Ohio. I need to look out when the Ohio State Fair is happening, or when a Columbus Clippers game is happening, or an Ohio State University football game is happening, and I need to see the tens of thousands of people, and I need to have compassion, and I need to want them to be saved. But I also need to care about the person who rings up my groceries. I need to care about the person who lives next door to me. I need to care about the person with whom I interact, maybe on a daily basis, maybe just weekly or monthly, but I need to have compassion for that individual as well. And in our Luke examples, we see the more specific and more personal application of Jesus' compassion. Luke 7:11-17. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. So the Lord was able to, and again, it's not balance, just both things need to coexist in us. And of course they did in him. He had a broad compassion, and I'm sure broader than we could ever imagine, but he had a broad compassion for the people, but he had compassion for the individuals. And the same must be true for us. He came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. I think that's pronounced beer. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people. And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. They glorified God. And the word spread about God visiting his people. The word spread about what Jesus had done and about what he was able to do. Luke 10, this is the end of the story of the Good Samaritan, which Jesus tells to allow the people in his hearing to discern what it means to be a neighbor. And as this narrative ends, we read, "But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion." So this Samaritan had compassion on the one who had been attacked. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I'll repay you when I come back." Which of these 3, do you think, proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." We are to have compassion on people who are in need. Jesus tells this story to tell us that we need to go and do the same. We need to be like this Good Samaritan. And then one more, the compassion of a father, the parable of the lost son, the prodigal son. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him." The compassion is seen in an amazing way here. The father saw him from afar. He ran, he embraced him, he kissed him. Now the son still says the things that he wanted to say. The son said to him, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. We must believe that there are lost people. And it's not hard to believe that in a philosophical or generic sense, but we must allow that truth to be a conviction in our lives and change the way we interact with people. Jesus, the Son of Man, as he put it, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Here we have one who was lost and was found. We need to care about the lost. And this is whether it's someone who's perplexed, can't follow the directions, can't understand the Bible, perhaps, someone who genuinely is confused. This includes someone who is just overwhelmed sometimes. Sometimes we have people in our lives who just feel like there's no hope. They are entering into a state, or maybe already there, of despair. We can help people with directions, and we can help people with despair. We have the guidebook and we have hope. Of course, both of these in Jesus Christ. And we're all going to interact with people sometimes who have blindfolded themselves. They have so messed with their own lives that they have created barriers that seem insurmountable. They are blinded in such a way that we might even think there's no hope. But you know what? There always is. Jesus, he interacted with those tax collectors. We can bring anyone to the Lord, of course, that is willing. They have to accept it. But we can share who Jesus is. And people have been brought out of any and all of these situations and have come to Jesus Christ, have become disciples of his, have become Christians. So whether we label someone lost, confused, unsure, unclear, perplexed, disoriented, bewildered, whatever their particular way of being lost happens to be, what really matters is whether they know Jesus Christ or not, whether they are in him or they are not in him, whether they have been baptized into him, united with him in his death and resurrection, or not. We need to care enough. We need to have compassion that is strong enough to find out, first of all, and then if we find out they're lost, we need to help them. We need to show them the way. We are Christ's ambassadors. We are sometimes the only chance that someone will have to come to Christ. We may be the only Christian they interact with in their whole lives. We need to grab those opportunities, and we need to pray that other people will grab those opportunities as well. So, the lost, Luke 19, etc. Next week, we will begin our convictions concerning transformation. And next week, it'll be our new life in Christ from 2 Corinthians 5:11 through 21. For the next 5 weeks, we will look at how it is possible for a lost person to be transformed, but how we and other Christians can continue to grow as well, to make all of this more possible, to be positive in this negative world. May the Lord continue to bless us as we study his word.